Hi all, my name is June. Today I am going to explain one feel-good science fiction film name called Frequency. The story begins in October 1969. Frank Sullivan works as a fireman in New York City. Julia, his wife, is a nurse at a nearby hospital. John, his kid, is 6 years old. They adore baseball and intend to watch the 1969 World Series together on TV. Satch, an African-American officer, is Frank's best buddy. Gordo, a youngster his own age, is John's. Frank enjoys ham radio when he is not battling fires or spending time with his family. Let's go back to October 1999. Satch is either John's boss or his partner as a New York City cop. Gordo remains his best friend, but he is now married. John is still unmarried, and his girlfriend, Samantha, recently left him. During their stay, Gordo and his family discover and put up Frank's old ham radio. When Gordo and his family have left, John continues to experiment with the radio, and through a peculiar atmospheric occurrence, he meets his father 30 years in the past. But, he is unaware that he is conversing with his father. The communication was then disconnected. John and Satch are now working on the Nightingale killings, in which 3 nurses were murdered by a serial murderer in 1968 and 1969. While the case was never solved, one of the bodies was recently discovered, and the inquiry has been restarted. As part of the inquiry, John pays a visit to and interviews Mr. and Mrs. Shepherd, an elderly couple who reside close where the corpse was located. Mrs. Shepherd is an ex-nurse. Mr. and Mrs. Shepherd have a son, Jack. Jack worked as a detective in New York City. Jack died at a hospital 30 years ago. Next scene, Frank contacts John once again. Both are suspicious at first. John believes Gordo is playing a joke, while Frank believes someone is plotting to kill his family and grows enraged. John is the first to discover he is communicating with his father through time, and he attempts unsuccessfully to persuade him. Throughout the process, he explains the conclusion of the first World Series game, which takes place the next day in Frank's time. He also informs him that he is about to die in a warehouse fire, specifies the name of the location, and tells him that he died because he followed his instincts, but he would have survived if he had gone the other way. Frank remains suspicious thereafter, but he can't help but notice the next day when the World Series game proceeds precisely as the man claiming to be his son predicted. Suddenly he is summoned to a fire, which turns out to be the same warehouse where the man claiming to be his son claimed to have perished. He is trapped on the top level of the inferno, attempting what appears to be the only logical escape path, when he recalls John's statements that if he had gone the other way, he would have made it. He lives by turning around and going the opposite direction. Back in 1999, John is out drinking with Satch and Gordo, who are attempting to help him get over the painful 30th anniversary. John begins to have a jumble of contradicting memories, including those of his latter youth and adolescence, as well as his early years on the police force, when his father was present. He informs his companions, as if for the first time, which he is, that his father did not perish in a fire. They all gaze at him incredulously, knowing that Frank died of lung cancer only 10 years ago, in 1989. John realizes he has 2 sets of memories. He recalls life with his father after the fire, but he also recalls life when he assumed his father had been slain 30 years previously. This does not apply to anybody else. Satch and Gordo, for example, have changed abruptly, with no recall of Frank dying in a fire. It's as if they've always known he lived another 20 years and died 10 years ago. Later that evening, John contacts his father once more. Frank is not skeptical this time, and they spend some time becoming acquainted. Later, Frank, who is overjoyed simply to be alive, pays a visit to Julia in the hospital. During their conversation, she notices the doctor ready to provide medication to a patient to whom she had previously administered another medication, points out his error, and Julia saves Jack Shepherd's life. That night, in 1999, John is troubled by new recollections, this time of attending a funeral with his father but without his mother. The next day, he realizes that his mother no longer exists. During work, the Nightingale case expands to 10 victims instead of 3. Satch cannot understand why John thought it was just 3, and John realizes to his shock that one of the victims was his mother. The Nightingale killer killed Julia as the 6th lady. John informs Frank that Julia died 30 years ago. John claims Julia was not supposed to be in the hospital last night because she was working there. Julia would not have been to the hospital if Frank had died in the warehouse fire last night. John says, "Dad, you need to stop the Nightingale killer from killing the other women including Mom." Their aim is that Frank, informed with knowledge about each murder before it occurs, will be able to prevent the killings and apprehend the murderer. John informs Frank about the 4th woman victim murdered by the Nightingale killer. Frank goes to a pub, picks up a discussion with the 4th victim, thereby preventing her from leaving, resulting in the 4th victim not dying. John finds that the Nightingale killer only killed 9 women. John informs Frank about the 5th woman that was murdered by the Nightingale killer. The 5th victim is found at a pub. Frank is also present at the bar. As Frank is in the toilet, Jack enters the room and strikes Frank. Frank has no idea the man's name is Jack Shepherd. The Nightingale killer is revealed to be Jack. Frank is knocked out by Jack. Frank's license is stolen by Jack. As Frank awakens, he rushes to the 5th victim's flat and discovers that the woman has died. Frank tells what has happened to John, and John instructs him to keep the wallet somewhere where it will not be discovered for 30 years. John finds it as soon as Frank conceals it. He is later able to match the fingerprints to Jack Shepherd. John keeps the Nightingale killer's identity a secret from everyone. If Frank had perished in the warehouse fire 30 years ago, Julia would have left the hospital and Jack would have died there. If Jack had died in the hospital, he would not have been able to murder more than 3 women. Julia stayed at the hospital since Frank did not perish in the warehouse fire, and she saved Jack's life. Even though Frank did not perish in the warehouse fire, John wished Jack had perished at the hospital. John pays the Shepherds another visit. Mr. Shepherd is still alive. Mrs. Shepherd was killed 30 years ago by the Nightingale killer. Mrs. Shepherd was the final victim of the Nightingale killer. Jack works as a private investigator after leaving the police service due to corruption. John meets the modern-day Jack Shepherd in a pub and warns him cryptically that he is going down 30 years ago. Satch appears at Frank's residence in 1969 after John informs him that the Nightingale killer is Jack Shepherd. Satch informs Frank that his license was found in the flat of the Nightingale killer's 4th victim. Satch begrudgingly arrests Frank for the murder of the killer's 4th victim. As Frank and Satch are inside the interrogation room, Satch is skeptical that Frank was using his ham radio to communicate with John in the future. Frank makes his predictions about the current game, which is part of the 1969 World Series. Satch departs from Frank's cell to speak with Julia. Satch and Julia leave to go to another coffee shop. When Jack walks inside the interrogation room, Frank is taken aback. As Satch's partner enters the interrogation room, both Jack and Satch's partner leave. Satch's colleague is confused as to why Jack entered the interrogation room. "I entered the interrogation room because I believed you needed some assistance," Jack explains. As Jack returns to the interrogation room, Frank intends to electrocute him. Frank electrocutes Jack as he returns. Jack is no longer aware. Frank also knocked out all of the power in the police station. Frank then creates a fire, which triggers the sprinkler system in the building. Frank takes Jack's driver's license. Frank is able to exit the cell peacefully as everyone escapes the building and Jack lies face down in a pool of water. Jack never shut the door. Frank steals the file containing evidence against him. Frank walks quietly out of the police station. Frank saying he was using his radio to reach John who's in the future, Satch explains. Julia is unconvinced that Frank was using his radio to reach John from the future. Satch believes the current 1969 World Series game will happen just as Frank foretold. Frank enters Jack's flat. Inside Jack's apartment, Frank discovers pictures of the Nightingale victims, and Frank also discovers jewelry that belongs to the Nightingale victims. Jack returns to his flat. As Jack spots Frank, he attempts to shoot him, but Frank escapes. Satch and his partner go to Jack's flat as Jack is hunting Frank. Satch and his partner uncover the Nightingale victims' photographs and valuables. Jack pursues Frank to the water's edge. Frank surprised Jack at the waterfront. Frank desires to drown Jack. Satch and Satch's partner arrive when Frank exits the water. They are unable to locate Jack's body. Frank, Satch, and the others still assume Jack is dead. Frank approaches John once again when he returns home. Frank informs John that Jack has died, although Julia died in 1969. Sadly, John is knocked unconscious by an unknown stranger. It is discovered that Jack knocked John unconscious. In 1969, Jack must have realized that someone from the future had provided Frank with knowledge on the Nightingale murders. Before knocking out John, Jack knew that Frank's wife had given birth to John and that John had given Frank knowledge about the Nightingale murders. Frank is knocked out by Jack. Frank is handcuffed by Jack. Jack is clutching a gun, and he throws John's pistol away. John awakens and engages in a wrestling battle with Jack. Jack infiltrates Julia's room. Julia awakens, but Jack tries to kill her. As Frank awakens, he recognizes Julia's voice and understands that Jack is still alive. Frank is set free. As John walks into Julia's room, Jack knocks her unconscious. Frank possesses a gun. When Frank pulls out his gun, he notices Jack holding John hostage. "If you drop your gun, I'll let go of your son," Jack adds. As Jack snatches John's gun, he is going to murder him. Frank lays down his shotgun. Julia leaps onto Jack a few seconds later, and Jack releases go of John. Julia is pushed by Jack and falls on the ground. When Frank pulls out his gun, he shoots Jack's right hand. Jack's right hand is blasted off, and he flees Frank's residence. As Jack uses his right hand to strangle John, his right hand vanishes. Jack backs away in fear as his hand disappears, but he maintains John's rifle pointed at John. Once Jack's hand vanishes, he notices Frank holding his gun. Frank shoots Jack in self-defense as Jack prepares to kill Frank. Jack is no longer alive. John understands Frank is still alive because he stopped smoking 30 years ago. Father Frank and son John, both now in 1999, have their first hug after their reunion. Something has kept John's girlfriend from breaking up with him since Frank stopped smoking 30 years ago. The film concludes with John, Frank, John's kid, Satch, Gordo, and his son, in 1999, playing baseball together while Julia watches. Thanks for watching. Be kind and spread love.